Thank you, Omar, for the introduction, and Richard also for the invitation. I'm very pleased indeed to be able to participate in this event. As Omar referred to, we do go back a long way. He didn't quite tell you quite how far that is. It's the last century when we were together in Cambridge, so it is indeed a very long time. So what I want to do is really talk in two halves. The first half is a combination of background around the disease and the opportunities stem cells might offer for treatments for devastating neurological diseases, including MS, particularly thinking about the progressive phase of MS. And the second half, I'll give you some experimental details around some work that we ourselves have done. So this is where I'm from currently, in Edinburgh. So like most things in life, there's very little new, okay? The idea of regeneration is as old as the hills. So those of you who are classic scholars will know this. So this is the story of Prometheus. So in terms of Greek mythology or fable, Prometheus disobeyed Zeus and was punished. And the nature of the punishment to Prometheus imposed by Zeus was to be chained to a rock. That's pretty bad. And then to have to suffer his liver being eaten by an eagle. That's even worse. But just to absolutely finish off the torture, that particular torture of the eagle eating his liver was a torture to be endured every day. And the reason it was endured every day, because the eagle will come along, eat the liver, but the liver has stem cells and can regenerate. So the liver would regrow, the eagle will turn up the next day, and so on. So in many ways, the fable of Prometheus speaks to the power of the body or certain organs to repair or regenerate or renew. So this is what I mean by it's not new, it's old. But the idea that the brain might repair itself is comparatively new, and we'll come back to that. So the challenge, of course, of regenerative neurology is a very great one indeed. And to this audience, I don't need to lay out the problem, the nature of the problem, the burden to the individual as well as to society. But it's worth bearing in mind just what kind of scale the numbers are. The numbers of people who suffer with a neurodegenerative disorder, and this is just a list of some of them, is phenomenal. So in the UK, it's probably at least 1 million. UK is not very big, it's 60 million. So 1 in 60 people in the UK suffer with a disease which we can call neurodegenerative. And the feature about the neurodegenerative diseases, aside from their devastating impact to the individual, is that uniformly they are progressive and incurable, and there are no effective treatments. Now, no, I put MS in this category. Here I'm particularly referring to the progressive phase of MS, not the relapse remitting. We'll come back to that. But the progressive phase of MS has many features in common with other more classic neurodegenerative diseases. Just to be clear, it's not the same, but there are some important features that are in common. So it's against this background that stem cells have provoked a lot of thought and a lot of excitement. But as with many things, there's a risk of us getting carried away. And what I'm wanting to do in the next 15, 20 minutes is to try and give you not quite a reality check, but try and give you some realistic ideas about what stem cells might or might not offer in terms of new discoveries, but also potentially in terms of therapies for patients with diseases. So for those of you who don't know much about stem cells, they're terribly simple. These are cells which can do two things. So this is the stem cell. It can do two things. One is it can make more of itself, so it can self-renew. So in other words, the blue cell gives another blue cell. But the other crucial feature is it can specialize. So it can specialize into a different cell type. So for example, a brain stem cell can give rise to another brain stem cell, but in addition, it can give rise to the actual cells that make up the brain, the nerve cells and so on. That's all that a stem cell is. But it's those twin properties of self-renewal and specialization that makes it a fantastic opportunity for medicine. Because if that starting cell is a human stem cell, and you understand how to control its self-renewal and crucially understand how to direct it to generate the cells that you're interested in. So let's think, if we're interested in MS, we might be interested in making this pink cell effectively the cell that lays down myelin, the insulating cell. So now you could have the idea that you can generate millions or billions of these human myelin-making cells. Now, what you might do with that, we can discuss. But it's a step change in terms of what is now possible. We'll come back to that. So there are two major ways of thinking about stem cells. So I've told you that their power is that you can generate to vast scale, unlimited numbers of the right cell with the right postcode, if you like, for your disease of interest. We're interested in MS. So what might you do with that? There are two things. There are experimental opportunities. So this is where you're using the human stem cells or the human nerve cells that have come from those stem cells to study the disease, to discover new drugs. Those are experimental opportunities. But then there are the therapeutic opportunities, and these are the ones that the media tends to focus on. This is the idea where you will use the stem cells of itself to treat patients. My own view is in 20 years' time or 10 years' time, the major dividend, without question, for brain diseases will not be using the stem cells directly for therapy, but using stem cell-based discoveries to mobilize stem cells that are already in your brain. We'll come back to that. So what I need to do, first of all, is tell you a little bit about the workings of the brain and to make sense of the second half of the talk. So when I was at medical school in the last century, and things haven't changed that much, we were taught that the brain is terribly simple. It's made up of just 4 building blocks, or 4 types of cells. The 2 of those cells is the nerve cell, in blue, and then another cell is the red cell, which is the insulating cell, just lays down insulation. So one way of thinking about this is the nerve cell is just a wire, which carries electricity. If you want that to occur in an efficient way, you need insulation. There are 2 other cell types that make up the 4, but these 2 are sufficient. And what normally happens is this arrangement of the insulation and the nerve works beautifully. It's a dynamic interaction between the insulating cell and the nerve, and it's that which underpins the electrical circuitry that in turn controls everything that we do. All our actions, our ability to think, to remember, to emote, to feel, to move, are controlled by this fantastic symphony, if you like, of electrical activity. That's what happens when it's all working well. But clearly, if things go wrong, and things can go wrong to the nerve cell or to the insulating cell, this is what happens. The electrical connections are still occurring, but they're occurring much more slowly. So it's damaged. So the circuitry is damaged. And in turn, that results in symptoms or disability. That's it. So against that background, multiple sclerosis is particularly interesting for neurologists because it may not be obvious to yourselves, particularly patients with the progressive phase of the disease who understandably are frustrated by the lack of progress in terms of delivering treatments for progressive disease. But the truth is, in the totality of neurological diseases, from Alzheimer's through to MS, MS by a country mile is the pathfinder disease for neurology. It is the one disease group in neurology where we actually can do something. Historically, neurologists have always been criticized for all they do is chronicle demise in fancy language. They're very good at doing that, they're very good at talking, but they're not so good at doing things. In other words, giving treatments. And the reason we haven't been good at giving treatments is because the brain is that much more complex than any other organ. It's only now we're beginning to understand the basic workings of the brain that allow us to deliver treatments. But MS is the only major neurological disorder for which there are disease-modifying treatments. Remember, diseases like Parkinson's, there are treatments, but those are symptomatic treatments. They do not affect the trajectory of the actual disease. But MS is different. So that's why I regard MS as very much a pathfinder disease for all of neurology. That said, so of course, going back to what Omar said, when we were at medical school, in fact, even when we were studying together in our PhDs, there were no licensed treatments for MS. There are now about to be 11 licensed in the UK for relapse-remitting MS. The prospects of somebody who's newly diagnosed with MS in 2014 is, it's a world away from the prospects of somebody who was diagnosed with MS 20 years ago. The same cannot be said of many other neurological diseases. That said, there are still major challenges in MS, and the major one, of course, is this one. Well, that's all good and well if you're newly diagnosed with MS or if you've got relapse-remitting MS. How about those patients who've got established disease and or progression? What is available for them? Right now, today, there is no licensed treatment for that group of patients, and that's the area of research that we in Edinburgh and with many other colleagues in the UK and elsewhere are particularly focused on. That's where the unmet need is. So I just want to share this slide with you. I mean, much of this you will know, but there are three aspects of MS that strike me as unusual of these major neurological diseases. So you know about the burden of this disease. There's about 110,000 patients with MS in the UK. In the world, there's 2.5 million. Big problem. Unusually, this disease affects women more than men, 2, if not 3 times to 1. And also, unlike some of those other diseases I referred to on that earlier slide, which are the other neurodegenerative disorders, this is not something that's restricted to the older or more mature population. And many of you will know that. So that's telling us something. Females are more affected, younger people are more affected. Quite why, we don't really understand. The other feature is this, and it particularly resonates for myself, given that I'm now based in Edinburgh. And as you know, this time last week, there was a certain amount of uncertainty whether I'd be speaking to you from a different country perspective. But we're still part of the Union. And so what this slide shows is the UK is not very big. From top to bottom, it's about 500 miles. And yet the disease burden varies substantially depending on where you are in the UK. And this is a common feature of MS. So around here, there's about 110 to 120 patients with MS per 100,000. As you get up to Edinburgh, it's about 170. And if you go beyond Aberdeen, it's about 210. And the Orkneys is 400. So it's a very sharp gradient of this disease. So in other words, the further you are away from the equator, the more MS there is. And we simply don't understand why that is. But there is, again, another clue. And obviously people think about, is that to do with sunlight? There isn't much of it in Edinburgh, take it from me. And in turn, is that to do with vitamin D and so on? We don't really know. But I just put it out there as a very interesting observation. And it's quite different to the other major neurological diseases. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, motor neuron disease, their prevalence is uniform throughout the UK. They broadly are equal male-female. So MS is different. The other feature about MS is this. So here's back to a cartoon. This is the yellow is the nerve cell or the wire, and the red is the insulating cell. When we were at medical school, we were taught that this disease was essentially a problem of loss of the insulation. So you then have this naked part of the wire, and that's vulnerable and it dies. But what we've learned since is this. The insulating cell absolutely does do insulation, but it also does something else. These are recent discoveries. The details don't matter, but what this cartoon is showing is that in addition to the insulation, the myelinating cell also provides energy or nutrients or support to the nerve cells. And if you think about that, the implication is if you pull away the energy, the support, the nutrients, well, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out what might happen to the nerve. It's going to die. And that's important when you think about the disease pathology. So you'll, I'm sure, be familiar with this trajectory of the disease. So most patients, 85% of patients, will have attacks. Those are these peaks of blue. They recover, attack, recover, and so on. That's the relapse-remitting phase, for which now there are lots of treatments. Over time, typically about 10 years, patients stop having individual attacks, and they just accumulate disability. That's called the progressive phase of the disease. What we understand is that this early phase of the disease is all about loss of the insulation. But the late phase of the disease, the progressive phase of the disease, is about loss of the nerve cells, hence neurodegeneration. Does that make sense? Okay. That's important. So this is the current state of play today in 2014. It's good, but it needs to be better. We know that for a newly diagnosed patient, let's say patient 1, who's diagnosed today, goes to see Omar or Richard, there's a whole load of treatments that Richard and Omar and others can offer. And some of them are so effective, they may even prevent these attacks. So there's lots of treatments. DMT is just disease-modifying treatments. But patient 2, who's got established disease, there's no treatments. That's the challenge. And of course, what do they need? They need 2 things. They need a treatment that will stop the disease, but they also ideally need something that will reverse what they've lost, repair. And that, of course, is the sort of professional fantasy or home run. It's a long game, but that's what we're working towards. So just to give you a summary, if you like, of what I've told you. This is the normal state of play. Nerve cell, the myelinating cell, and it makes these wraps around the nerve cell. That's health. Then you lose the myelin when you've had a relapse, an attack, and that's what you get. And there are now 2 options. The prediction is, because I've explained that this cell is crucial for the health of the nerve cell, if you lose it, the nerve cell will die. But the counter, more positive prediction, so that's the degeneration bit, is if you could put back that myelin like a plaster, could you protect the nerve? Regenerate, protect. So I tend to try and be a positive person. So rather than say I'm interested in degenerative diseases, I say I'm interested in regeneration. So that's what we're about. And that laying down of new myelin is called remyelination. But remember what I said to you, when we were at medical school, we learned, the dogma that we learned about the brain, unlike the liver, the skin, blood cells, that brain simply does not have the capacity to regenerate. This bloke you won't know is called Cahal, who's the sort of father of neuroscience. Brilliant, brilliant man, got just about everything right, except this. So we learned the dogma that the brain, whatever grows, will not regenerate, but that's actually not true, which is good news. And here's an example. So this is a brain scan of a patient with MS, and what the arrow points to are areas of damage or loss of myelin. And this is the pathological correlate of that. So normally, a healthy brain in this area is blue. When it loses its myelination, it's white. That's all that you're seeing. But can you see at the back this area that's ringed red, which is a pale blue? Yeah, this bit? That was once white. But it's now pale blue, and it's pale blue because new myelin has been laid down around that area. So that would have been white, but then new myelin has been laid down, and for reasons I just don't have time to go into, that is protective of the underlying nerve cell. Okay? So this is brilliant proof of concept that the brain can lay down new myelin, I'm calling that repair. I haven't got the time to go into it, but that new myelin is coming from stem cells. To be absolutely clear also, though I think you've worked this out, this has absolutely nothing to do with doctors. It's in spite of doctors, not because of doctors. This is an example of the brain repairing itself. So the challenge for all of us is to understand why in some people does it occur well, but in others it doesn't occur so well. And if you understand that, it's much easier to open a door, if you like, that's half open than one that's closed. So what I'm really telling you is that the brain does have the capacity to repair itself. The best example of that happens to be in MS, and here's an example. So what we're interested in is understanding how do you increase and promote and supplement this spontaneous, natural process that already occurs in the brain. This comes back to stem cells. So what I told you about stem cells, that they can do these 2 things. They can give rise to more of themselves, so you can get scale. And the scale is phenomenal. You can start with these human embryonic stem cells or pluripotent stem cells in a little flask the size of my palm of my hand. There's about 500,000 cells in there. In 100 days, that 500,000 cells goes to hundreds of billions of cells. And it's just essentially a form of scientific cookery. It's just mixing stuff. It's expensive cookery very expensive, but nonetheless, it's cookery. And it's not even the sort of Gordon Ramsay end of cookery, it's more Delia Smith. It really is just straightforward cookery, okay? But you can generate vast numbers of those cells, and here's an example. So these are all brain stem cells. And these are human brain stem cells, which by definition could give rise to those 4 cell types that make up the brain that I've told you about. So now what can you do with those? You can do 2 things. You can do discovery, learning about the disease, identifying new drugs, or you might look at treatments. So this is just, all of this works from our lab. The details don't matter. But the beautiful thing about this system is you can generate cells which carry the right postcode for the disease you're interested in. I'm also interested in other degenerative diseases, for example, Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, you lose this particular nerve cell, which is in about this part of the brain. Motor neurone disease, you lose motor nerve cells. I'll come back to that. And this is the myelinating, the insulating cell that you lose in MS. So we can make loads of those. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So I want to just tell you about this disease very briefly, and you'll see why in a moment. So this, for some of you may know, this bloke's called Lou Gehrig. So in the US, motor neurone disease is also known as Lou Gehrig disease, or ALS. And you may have come across this ice bucket challenge in the last few weeks, which has really captured people's imagination. That's all around ALS. I'm also interested in motor neurone disease. This is a terrible, terrible disease. It's a progressive, paralyzing, wasting disorder. Sadly, 50% of patients at the time of diagnosis, from the time of diagnosis, are dead within 18 months. Terrible, terrible disease, okay? What we understand about this disease is a problem of the nerve, but here the nerve is the motor nerve, and the motor nerve makes a connection with muscle. And the problem is between the communication of the motor nerve and the muscle, okay? There are no effective treatments for this. The reason I'm throwing this up is, unlike MS, motor neurone disease also has major genetic abnormality. So there are some people who just carry a faulty gene. And if you have that faulty gene, you will get familial inherited motor neurone disease. The details don't matter. It's about 10% of the population. But what it also means is that you can do a very interesting experiment to study this disease. And I'll tell you how. And then I'll try and explain how that might be useful for MS. So because of major discoveries in the field in the last 10, 15 years, most of you will know Dolly the sheep. Heard of Dolly the sheep? So Dolly the sheep is a brilliant example of generating a master stem cell from any old cell. Okay? So what we can now do, building on the discoveries of Dolly the sheep, which was by Ian Wilmot, a colleague in Edinburgh, so that was in Edinburgh, is you can take from anybody here, and indeed with Omar and Richard, this is exactly what we've done with some patients from Imperial. Take a skin biopsy. This is a straightforward procedure. Even Omar could do this. Okay? Just about. Take a little skin biopsy, outpatient, 20 minutes, 5 pp's. You grow up the skin cells, and then get back to that cookery business I've told you. Now, this is Gordon Ramsay cookery now. And you transform those skin cells into master stem cells. Those master stem cells are now, by definition, unique and personal and bespoke to the patient, because they're identical to that patient. So from that patient now, you have master stem cells. So you can now make nerve cells that are appropriate for that patient. Now imagine you start with the skin cells from a patient with inherited motor neurone disease. You make the master stem cell from that patient. You now make the motor nerve cells, because those are the nerve cells that are dying in that patient. So you make motor nerve cells that carry the faulty gene from that patient, and you make motor nerve cells from a healthy relative, say a sister or brother. So everything else is matched, the genes, but this person has the dodgy gene, this one doesn't. And then you simply do a very simple experiment. So you've got motor nerves that carry the faulty gene, motor nerves that are healthy. And you just ask questions, what is it about the motor nerve that is faulty, that's different to the healthy one? And when you do that, and this is a very simple experiment, we did this. So we did this with patients with inherited motor neurone disease. Details don't matter. Red are the ones with the faulty gene, blue are the ones with the healthy. And you can see that those that carry the faulty gene, their motor nerves are 2.5 times more likely to die in some assay measuring system that we had. So you might be wondering, well, so what? Well, you could predict that. The so what is this. If you then take those motor nerves and you effectively, just using some technological tricks, you effectively put in a reporter system, like a traffic light system, so that they're red when they're dying and they're green when they're healthy, okay? So then what you do is you go to drug companies who've got 500,000 compounds on their walls. They have all these compounds, but they don't know if they work or not. And you simply screen using robotics, because you can generate billions of these cells. You just have a factory of these. You've put in the traffic light system, and you ask the compound, just find me any compound that will take the red line closer to the blue line. Do you see? And then what you will have from the 500,000, you will find, well, guess what? 50 of these compounds make the red blue. And then you say, well, let's now work on those 50 and see if there are any drugs out there that marry to those. Does that make sense? So this is where human stem cells is a 21st century drug discovery tool. And this is the reason I'm very excited by this field, because I think through this technology, we will understand and identify drugs and compounds that we can then use that can mobilize stem cells that are already in your brain. So rather than putting in stem cells, why don't we harness the stem cells that are already in your brain? So this is coming to the last few slides. So I've told you about the discovery end of this, but obviously there is an idea that you might use stem cells directly to treat patients with MS, or indeed any other diseases. So how might you do that? There are two ways to think of this. One is, if you like, it's the SAS approach, where you can make all these oligodendrocytes, these myelinating cells in a dish. You can always find a brain surgeon who's up for transplanting them into patients. So you could parachute them in, hence the SAS. All right? So this is the idea that you'll transplant stem cells or your myelinating cells into the damaged brain. For reasons I don't have time to, I don't think that's the wisest move for MS. The other approach, which I think is a bit more sophisticated, is I've already told you that there are stem cells already in the brain, but they're perhaps not doing what they should do. Can you activate them, mobilize them? And I think the answer will be yes, using drugs. And drugs we've discovered from the stem cells that I've just told you about. But I'll give you two examples of that. This is a brilliant proof of concept example. Details don't really matter other than this. There is an animal model where the animal has a faulty gene so that the insulation is imperfect. And they lay down very little myelin. So myelin is normally green. So this is the animal, and because it can't make myelin, you just have these naked nerve cells that are red. A colleague in New York, state of New York, Steve Goldman, brilliant neurologist, he made stem cells, human, and made the myelinating cell, that's this cell, and he thought, well, I'll make human stem cells, human insulating cells, and I'm going to transplant them into this brain of this mice that don't make myelin. What happens? Two things happen. Myelin occurs. By definition, it's all human myelin. The second thing, which is astonishing, normally the animal, this is the blue line, dies at 150 days. It gets epilepsy and so on. After the transplant and the laying down of new myelin happens to be human, the animal's living beyond 260 days. So it's just a proof of concept that if you repair the myelin around nerves, it can be protective. I'm not advocating this is what we would do. I'm simply illustrating a concept that oligodendrocytes here in transplant can be fantastically neuroprotective. So these last two slides is bringing it closer to home, and this is coming to the end. Now you'll all be aware that there are stem cells all over the body. And there's another type of stem cells that is in fat tissue and in the big bones. And these are called mesenchymal stem cells. So we all have these. And so these are adult stem cells. Now, normally these stem cells do three things. Apart from making more of themselves, they can make three types of cells. They can make fat cells, make bone cells, and make cartilage. Now, for reasons, again, I don't have time to go into, rather surprisingly, over the last 10, 15 years, people studied these stem cells in animal models of MS. And they found remarkably that if you injected these into these animals which had a form of MS, it's not the same, obviously, that these stem cells seem to be beneficial or protective of the animal model of MS. That then led to, well, that's very interesting, though we don't really understand how. Would that be relevant to humans? So this is the idea that these stem cells may be therapeutic for other ways. Now, not because they're making bone, fat, or cartilage. Having extra fat or bone in your brain isn't going to be a good idea. We know that. So we conducted a study, which I began when I was in Cambridge and finished in Edinburgh, which was supported by the MS Society, and it was a simple proof of concept study. We looked at a few patients in very great detail. So these are patients with established disease, secondary progressive disease, all with marked disability, so needing a stick at least. And we took from all 10 patients bone marrow. We then cultured up these mesenchymal stem cells, and then we injected it back to them, having grown up massive numbers, a bit like a blood transfusion. I must confess, I expected this to be, frankly, a waste of time, but an important question to ask, because that's our job, is to do the experiment and then react to the result. But I did think it would be a complete waste of, not complete waste of time, but it wouldn't be helpful.
Ineffective.
Pardon?
Completely ineffective as opposed to a waste of time.
Completely ineffective. I think you should be up here speaking. All right. So in order to measure success or failure of this intervention, what we did was we took the patients and we did various tests, but we measured the nerves at the back of the eye, and you will know that the nerves at the back of the eye, that's this, the optic nerve, gets affected in MS. So we measured the nerve at the back of the eye before the treatment at 3 different time points, and because it's a progressive phase of the disease, the nerves are getting smaller, and hence the grade, so you can see it's a gentle decline. You can see that's because the nerves are getting smaller. And then we gave them the stem cells and measured it again twice. And we'd expect it to carry on going down. And if you shift the gradient up, that would imply that you've had some sort of protective effect on the nerves. Now, this was blinded, by which I mean the people who were doing the measuring did not know which patients got what. So trying to limit bias. Now, to my astonishment, you can see it's gone up. So this suggests that the mesenchymal stem cells somehow were having a beneficial role. This isn't because they were making new nerves. Don't think so at all. What I think was happening is that they were modifying the environment around the damaged nerves and enabling those stem cells that are already there to lay down new myelin. I can't prove that yet, but I'm pretty sure that's what was happening. But a very interesting observation nonetheless. On the back of that, many others, and particularly here in Imperial, is Paolo here? Yes. Yeah. Paolo and Richard, Omar and others are now leading the next phase of this study as part of an international partnership. And I think, in fact, Richard and Paolo have done a fantastic job in recruiting. So there are others following through these observations, albeit in a different phase of MS. But I'm really using this as an example of experimental medicine, because to end where I began, the need is for new treatments, the need is for innovation. Early phase of MS, I wouldn't say solved, but has had huge advances. The established phase of MS is where the unmet need is. You need a lot more innovative experimental medicine. That means you need clinical trials. One of the areas that we're interested in pursuing is how can you exploit stem cells either directly, like these mesenchymal stem cells, or using drugs to mobilize stem cells already in the brain. So this is my final slide. This is just to acknowledge the various people who support me. Thank you very much.
I'm sure Siddharthan would be happy to take a few questions. If I could just remind you, if you're going to be asking some questions, if you could wait for somebody to bring the microphone down to you so that the question can be heard by the rest of the audience so we can put it into context. Thanks. Are there any burning questions? This gentleman here? Who's got a microphone? Lilina.
Do we do the ticker thing?
Yeah, we will in a minute.
Hi.
Tom, you'll prompt me, won't you, about doing the... We'll do it at the end, will we? Okay. Right, sorry.
Hi. We'll have
Hi.
another referendum.
The myelin is all about protecting the nerve cells. Does remyelination actually resurrect the dead nerve cells?
Short answer is no. No.
So once they're dead, they're dead.
Yes.
So there's no regeneration of nerve cells?
I think at a level of function, in a way that will be useful for patients in the adult context, no. I can qualify that. New nerve cells can be generated even in the adult human brain, but those are mostly in particular parts of the brain. But in terms of the general functions that are lost, in terms of mobility and thinking, the idea that you can make new nerve cells, I think, is remote and unlikely. But the idea of protecting dying as opposed to dead is much more realistic. And the process of dying is not on-off, it's not binary, it's over a very long period of time. So that window where the intervention might be helpful is actually quite long.
Thank you. Any other questions? That gentleman with the red top on at the back, Lilina? At the back.
Back. No, just...
No, over there.
There's somebody over there as well.
Okay. Go to them in a second.
I know that with stem cells, it can sort out the problem, the damage. But I know also that you have you been able to deactivate the stem cell before it turns into a tumor? Have you been able to do that yet?
Yeah, so it's an important question you raise. Like everything in life, with benefit comes risk. It depends really. So if, as I've tried to illustrate, I think the long-term hope is to mobilize stem cells that are already in your brain. And in that case, I think the risk of having tumors from that is very, very remote. But you're quite right. If you're putting in stem cells or stem cell derivatives into the brain, by definition, I told you that one of the things they can do is make more of themselves. So the other cell that can make more of themselves is, of course, the cancer cell. That's what cancer cells do. But there are very advanced ways now, which are actually quite simple, to limit that. So I think the risks of tumor or uncontrolled growth from stem cells is an important one that we're aware of, but I don't see that as a problem anymore for various reasons.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's a question over there.
Question then, there's a question at the back.
Okay.
Hi. Quick question about remyelination, really. Something called Lingo-1. Do you have any updates, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know quite a lot about that. I know that, so this is a drug made by Biogen. It's just going through a phase 2 trial. So for others who won't know, so the idea here is I've told you that laying down of new myelin could be protective. I've also told you that it doesn't occur very well in most patients. So this drug, the idea is it can promote this remyelination. That's what the drug's supposed to do. That's actually just going through a phase 2 study run by Biogen. The results aren't out. The early animal work was very encouraging. The phase 2 study just hasn't yet reported, so I don't know what the outcome will be. But that is actually just one of a slew of drugs in early development, all aimed at promoting myelin or remyelin. That's where the whole field is going.
There's another question down there. Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Yep. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. It's very encouraging that stem cells might one day be used to help repair some of the damage that's done in multiple sclerosis. My very primitive understanding suggests that it's actually an autoimmune disease that's causing the damage in the first place. Although we might be encouraging repair, would that address the underlying problem, which is the immune system attacking itself?
Yeah. So your understanding isn't very primitive at all. It's really rather sophisticated. I think the idea is this. What patients need for this disease, and indeed any disease, they need two things. They need treatments that will stop the disease, which is dealing with the autoimmune. And for those people who have disability, they need treatments that will repair lost function. So I wouldn't see stem cells or indeed any other repair-type treatments in isolation. Treatments will be combinatorial. People will be given a mix of treatments which will hit different parts of the disease. So they will have treatments to hit the driver of the disease as well as drugs to try and repair.
Kevin?
Yes, and this is probably, you probably just answered some of this with the previous question, but I mean, what you're saying is, I think, what hopefully we all believe, and that is the body is a pretty amazing piece of kit, and the brain is a pretty complex piece of kit. And there's maybe the ability to regenerate itself. And one way to do that may be through stem cells, be it your own, and triggering something in your own stem cells, but something triggers our own body to begin to degenerate itself. And I'm guessing that in a normal person that doesn't have MS, that their stem cells and everything that happens with their stem cells in their brain is kind of either regenerating itself or continuing to function. Are there other things outside of just drugs, which in a normal person are triggering the body to repair itself all the time and not destruct itself?
There are. I mean, I'll give you one example, which again we'll know is age affects this. So the aging brain, and in fact the aging body is less good at renewal and regeneration. We all know that. When we were young, if you fell over, you recovered better and so on. And there are some fantastic experiments that show that the remyelination, for example, if you simply do it in a young animal and an old, everything else is identical. In the old, it takes forever. Okay? So age, so you know, the elixir of youth and so on. But we also know that there are circulating factors in the young that can, if you like, rejuvenate the old. So of course then the race is on, can you get drugs that can mimic that? That's an example. The other one which is linked to that is the idea that the environment and activities are useful, exercise and so on. So you're quite right, we don't really understand what is it about aging that is negative for repair, but the flip side is what is it about the youthfulness that is positive.
Lillian, there's a gentleman here putting his arm. Just second row.
I've heard that simvastatin, a treatment for anti-cholesterol, is beneficial for the treatment of MS. Have you heard of this? And in what way is it effective?
No, I've more than heard of it. So the bloke who led that study is not here, Jeremy Chataway, but the other guy who was very involved in that is Richard. So simvastatin, many of you will know, is a cholesterol-lowering agent. But here's another example where a drug which was useful for condition X actually has multiple effects. Just like aspirin. Aspirin can be used for headaches, for migraine, for pain relief, for heart attacks, stroke, rheumatoid arthritis. Simvastatin, the story is this. It was found to be useful in those animal models of MS, the same ones I told you these stem cells were useful. And so Jeremy Chataway, so this is a great example of, I think, brilliant innovation and a made in the UK type of research. Jeremy Chataway and Richard, they studied simvastatin at a high dose in patients with progressive MS. It's a phase 2 study. And the take-home point is this, again, very encouraging, is that those patients who took the simvastatin as opposed to the placebo sugar arm, it was beneficial with respect to disease progression. And they measured disease progression by doing brain scans. What that now needs is to repeat the study on a bigger scale. It's called a phase 3. And then if it stacks up, it's something that people would obviously be very excited about because we know an awful lot about simvastatin. It's essentially safe. It's as cheap as chips. So it'll be great.
Thank you. Teresa?
Hi. I was number 6 in your trial. And interested to see that the optic neuritis level moved up. Why didn't it affect anything else?
Okay. It may have affected other things, but we were particularly measuring the optic nerve. And the optic nerve, so as you know, measuring anything in the brain is difficult. Unlike other organs, where you can take a biopsy and actually look at it under the microscope, you clearly can't do that for the brain. So the eye is our best opportunity to objectively measure success or failure of any treatments for the brain. So the optic nerve, we did 3 measurements of the optic nerve. One was actually measuring the size using the X-rays. The second was the eye test. And the third test was an electrical test, the visual evoked responses. We simply don't have tools to measure with the same level of precision other nerves in other parts of the brain. So we're using the optic nerve, if you like, as a surrogate for the rest of the brain.
but there was I know there was no physical change on other things. The
Well,
vision was improved, but other things weren't.
Okay. Well, well, everybody's different. So what I'd also say is that the sensitivity of the eye and the threshold to show response is quite different to the sensitivity or the extent that you would need to demonstrate to show response, say if you've got a paralyzed arm or a paralyzed leg.
I'm actually we've slightly overrun, so I'm going to stop at that point because we're infringing into your coffee break, which is a crucially important part of it. So I'd just like to thank Siddharthan